Well, we've been in a series on prayer, and we're nearing the end of it. And I've got to say, I'm a little bit saddened by that because what we've had an opportunity over the last 6 weeks is we've got to see God answer some incredible prayers and do some incredible things. And so it's one of those things sometimes, we just kind of get in rhythm and we just kind of do the same old thing. And so we've been able to kind of shine a big spotlight again on prayer and kind of, reinvigorate, if you will, some of our lives. I know it has for me. And watching God do some incredible things. In the last 2 months, we've had an opportunity to baptize over 20 people. And so, give God a hand on that. That's incredible. And so our prayer is that it just keeps happening and keeps happening. And, we've seen some people come to salvation. We've seen folks, have prayers that are answered for different reasons. And so it's been exciting to see that. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to kind of give you a real quick Reader's Digest, a review of some of the messages that we've done. And if you're here visiting and this is your first time, I haven't been here for any of this series, you're actually right at the right time, because where I spent 30 to 40 minutes, and some of you might went, it might have been longer than that. On some of these messages, you're going to get it reduced down. You're going to get the mini sermon on some of these for like 5 minutes and get, the meat of it. And so, if you want to listen to some of the others, we've got them on YouTube. You can go to our website and go back and hear the whole thing if you want to. If you're having problems sleeping at night, that's what Kim does. She just plays one of my messages back and just, goes right off to sleep. And so it can be helpful for that, if nothing else. But we've looked over the last few weeks, and I'm gonna start with actually last week, because that'll be the freshest in our mind. And we talked about what was the biggest motivator of prayer. And Blaine answered it. He said, answered prayer. That's our biggest motivator for prayer. That's why, we pray, and we pray more, and we pray because God answered, and then He answered another one, then He answered another one. I was like, I'm going to keep praying. I'm on a roll. And so then we asked, the question of what is the biggest demotivator of prayer? And Blaine answered that one too. Remember, Blaine? You said unanswered prayer. And so that's exactly it. We pray, and it's like our prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. We pray, and nothing's happening. It just seems to be the same old, same old. And so what we said was that basically there are times that God just says no, right? We pray, and God goes, nah, I don't think so. And for some of us, we're pretty thankful that God didn't answer that prayer for us, right? Later on we saw him or we saw her and we went, woo, I'm so glad that God didn't answer that prayer. And then we said sometimes God says slow. Basically, kind of, hey, it's going to happen, but you're going to grow in this process and everything. And which led us to that next part. We had no, slow, and then grow. That God is more interested in growing you up, maturing you, in Him, that you would still be willing to trust Him and all those different dynamics that are there. And then we said sometimes there's just unknown. It's kind of like God answers this prayer over here for this person and then doesn't for this person. He answers for this group of people but not this group of people. He answers for this request but not that request. And we sometimes scratch our head and there's this unknown. Why did God answer that one but not that one? This other one seems so much bigger. And what we said was this, in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8, is that God just simply says this. He says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. In retrospect, it's just basically looking at it and going, all right, it's just, will you continue to trust God? Even though your requests aren't answered the way you think they ought to be or what you would like for them to be, would you be willing to still continue to trust God? And so we mentioned this the week after that or before that when we said this. Is there a certain way to pray? Are there certain levers that you twist and and pull and if I come to church and I sing the right song and the offering plate goes by and I put a little bit of money in there and I pray. Countless times we have people that come to church and when they come in the door, you can just see it on their faces that they're struggling. They're having some difficulties and they're coming and kind of hoping maybe I can get some answers. Maybe if I come to church, my prayers that I'm saying, maybe God will answer them. is there a specific way that we can kind of paint God into a corner and go, oh, I got you, God, because I did all of these things. Now you've got to answer my prayer. And so what we said was this. We said, Jesus' guys, these were good Jewish, young men that grew up with Jewish prayers and knew who God was, to the best of their abilities. But they noticed something different, that when Jesus prayed, things happened. And they were kind of like, what's going on here? Because there would be times Jesus would just kind of go and be by himself for a while, and then he'd show back up. And there were just times, Jesus say a little bitty prayer, and there's like people would be raised from the dead, be feeding thousands of people. All those different dynamics. They saw something that was different about Jesus' prayer life. And so they asked him, one day they said, Jesus, what is it? What is it that makes your prayer different than ours? I mean, teach us to pray. And we've all probably heard, if you've been in church any time at all or anything, you've heard the Lord's Prayer, right? This is one that starts with, Our Father who art in heaven. And many of you may have memorized it as a child. But Jesus basically, he goes, here's how you should pray. And he gives kind of this model prayer. Now, what he wasn't saying was, all right, just pray that prayer. What he was saying was, here's how this starts. And when we dissected it, basically we said, first of all, it's declaring God's greatness. That how will it be thy name? It's starting off with God, who he is and how magnificent that he is and all those different dynamics. And then it was, the second was surrendering to his will. When he says, Our Father who art in heaven, how will it be thy name? Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done. That was the King James Version. And so that's what I grew up in. That's what's just stuck in my head. And so, he goes, look, that my deal, basically you're going, your deal, God, is bigger than my own personal deal. That there's a greater, bigger picture that God is at work in the lives of different people and in different circumstances and different situations and stuff. And we're a part of that dynamic. But it's going, God, I would like this, but I'm going to trust you, whatever your will is for my life. And then obviously acknowledging our dependence on him. That in the process of that prayer is just saying, God, man, I'm trusting you and I'm depending on you. For us in America, we go to the refrigerator, we pull food out, and we got electricity, we hit the light switch and it's on, and we jump in our cars, we go to work. Our dependence on God isn't as heavy as it would be for a person in a developing country that, every day, your refugees that are fleeing, Syria and the different countries. Can you imagine carrying your family and just not knowing where you were going or what was going to happen? All you knew is, I got to get out of there. And imagine at that point, a prayer like that would come to life, for you and your family. And so that's what Jesus was talking about. And then the next week, Jay spoke, and he talked about basically like prayer busters. Are there things that kind of like, when we pray, that God goes, you know what? You need to go take care of that before you come to me. You need to take care of some things before you come to me. Interestingly enough, is husbands, one of those things is with our wives. Paul talks about it. He goes, hey, make sure you got stuff squared away with your wife before you come to me. Every one of these instances where God says you need to take care of something before you come ask for me for some things, deals with people. There's an instance where basically Jesus talks about a man going to the temple, to offer, his sacrifices. And basically Jesus says he needs to make sure before he goes and offers his sacrifices to God to try to get things squared away this way. If he has problems with his brother or has problems with somebody else, he needs to go resolve that first. So God's saying, wait a minute. What you're saying to God is, before my worship to you, what you're saying is to go take care of this out here first. And he goes, exactly. And so he talks about, forgiving of others. If you can't forgive others, don't come to me and ask for forgiveness. That's that whole dynamic that is there. And so when it comes to prayer, there's all those different dynamics that are there. And then the week before that, we talked about 4 different types of praying, if you will. And maybe you fall into one of these categories at some point in your life. We talked about the Samson prayer. Remember Samson, if you know about the Bible or anything, he was like a Hercules. He was just strong guy. His hair was all grown out. And so he was one of the judges, if you read back in Judges in the Old Testament. Here's Samson. Samson lives his life just like he wants to, all that kind of stuff. He's about 20 years and one of the judges of Israel. And here's Samson. He sits there, and at the end of his life, he finally kind of like prays to God. It's kind of like, I've tried everything else and nothing else is working, so I guess all that's left to do is to pray. And so that's where we find ourselves. Sometimes we just go, man, I've tried everything else. I guess all we have left to do is just pray about it. And so then there's the folks who have prayed. Maybe you prayed and it didn't happen. That person got sicker. That marriage didn't, get fixed. That whatever that is, and you prayed about it and you said, see, prayer doesn't work. Prayer's no good, and so therefore I abandon prayer itself. So maybe that's where you are in that area of prayer. And then thirdly, we talked about just the generic prayer. That's that person that, and I fall into this category, have fell into it. I'll get it out in a minute. Have fallen into that, at some point in my life, and probably will at some point. You just kind of do. You just kind of pray, right? I mean, you get up in the morning, you do, I got to pray because I'm a Christian. I'm the preacher. I got to pray. Dear Lord, okay, what do I got to do today? I got to do some of these things and stuff. Oh, yeah. Dear Lord, and you just, your mind's going everywhere. And I got to get to the point where protect my family, right? Protect my wife, protect my kids, protect the grandkids, protect, you got to get to that part, right? Because you're afraid if you don't get to that part and something happens, you go, man, I should have prayed. And so, but basically, it's kind of like the same thing day after day after day. And so there's kind of that generic prayer. And then lastly, we talked about this one here, was what we call the Daniel prayer. And James, Jesus' brother, he writes it this way. He says, the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Now, if you got to have someone to pray for you, you want to find that person, right? Who's a righteous person, because their prayers are powerful and effective. So we're like going, okay, I may not fall into that category, but I need to find somebody like that. And Daniel was like that. Daniel, remember he was, in the book of Daniel, the lion's den and all those different dynamics that were there. There's so many other things that are there. But Daniel, one of the things that we read about is like 3 times a day he was praying. And so he'd pray in the morning as a good Jewish, man would do, and in the afternoon and in the evening. He would pray 3 times a day. And I can just imagine Daniel's prayers because Daniel had a huge responsibility. He was like number 2 in charge of the country. And so he had this huge responsibility. And so he's praying, for a variety of things. He's praying for more than just himself. He's praying for direction. He's praying for God's divine intervention. He's praying that God would be glorified, maybe through him and the things that he did and how he did things. And so when God shows up, here's the thing. When God shows up, big things happen. When we pray and we put these prayer requests, I'm not talking about just some little bitty thing. I'm talking about something, that's big going on in your life, and you kind of go, God, I need an answer of something huge. God is like, all right, bring it to me. January 30th, 1930, a man probably that most of you had never heard of, I hadn't heard of him until I started studying for this, is a guy by the name of Frank Labach. Anybody heard of him? He was actually on a stamp in 1989, I believe. They put him on a stamp. Basically, he was titled by Time magazine in, I believe, in the late 40s as the man of literacy. This guy went to other countries and everything and developed the ability to be able to help people to learn how to read, and it just spread and spread and spread. But this guy was a godly man. And so in his process of living his life, he decided, he goes, I feel like there's more to this relationship between me and God. There's more to it. And so he began to explore this thing, and he had this question of how do I bring it closer? And so he decided what he would do was, and I know you guys will be thinking about doing this later on, I'm sure, is that if he could at least 1 second of every minute of the day of the time he was awake, that he would think of God. So every minute, at least 1 second of his time was spent thinking about God, a little prayer or something about God. How many of you you're going to try this as you walk out there? Some of you are kind of going, whoa, like every minute? Yeah, every minute. And so Frank had this question, could I be in continual contact, in other words, with God? I mean, he took kind of like the the 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. I mean, pray continually type deal. I mean, he took it to the max of what Paul said. And so he said basically, he goes, I wanted this opportunity to see what God would do. And so what he said was one of the things that Frank said, he goes, I had to rebuild my prayer life from the ground up. I mean, this is a guy that would have considered a godly man that was doing wonderful things. He said, I had to rebuild my prayer life. And so he said one of the things he did to help him do this was he did a deal called shooting people with prayer. You know, and so he said what he would do is as he walked by people or whatever and he made eye contact with them, you know, that all of a sudden he'd just make eye contact and just a little prayer, little prayer, little prayer, little prayer. You know, I can just imagine him kind of going, you know, now you go to jail for that. You know, in school, you get suspended, so don't do it, kids. All right, think of another way. But basically, he would just do that. And what he said was, he said the people that would walk by, he said some people there was no reaction. He said there were other people that would walk by and he would just give a brief prayer and just kind of, you know, glance their way or whatever. And he says there were times when he passed by people, he kind of looked back and he'd see them kind of like smile, kind of like, I don't know what that was about, but, you know, and just keep on going. And so 6 months into the experiment, this is what he wrote in his journal. I think it's up there. He says, last Monday was the most completely successful day of my life to date. So far as giving my day in complete and continuous surrender to God is concerned. I remember how as I looked at people with a love that God gave me, he said they looked back and acted as though they wanted to go with me. I felt then that for a day I saw a little of that marvelous pull that Jesus had as he walked along the road day after day, God intoxicated and radiant with the endless communion of his soul with God. See, a prayer experiment like this turning it into a commute or a walk and just, you know, praying for people at different times. You know, basically it was the 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1. You know, Paul says this, he says, I urge then, first of all, the petitions, the prayers, and the intercession and thanksgiving be made for who? All people. And that's exactly what he did. He's like, I'm going to pray for every single person. You know, what if instead of just reading the news, we started praying about it? I mean, I think everybody, you know, yesterday our hearts just sank as the news flashed and more information came, you know, from Stillwater. And we still think about that today, and we think about our own kids and all that kind of stuff. And we hear the news, and you just imagine in your mind, you know, families going to this event and excited and watching a float and being, you know, cheering on your team and all that kind of stuff and having your family there, only to be disrupted and your whole life to change that fast. And our hearts hurt, and we sit there and we kind of go, you know, is there anything we can do? And one of those things that we can do, obviously, is to pray for these families and to pray, God, what would you have me to do? Is there anything I can do, you know, to help them, you know, through this process? And so it's taking a meeting with a friend or something, you know, and turning it into an opportunity of prayer. It's taking, you know, every problem, every situation, you know, maybe in your workplace or whatever it is, and praying God and asking God, how do you want me? What do you want me to do, you know, with what you've given me? In this praying without ceasing kind of dynamic, that is just kind of being a little bit more prayer sensitive, if you will. I'm not saying, you know, try to do it every minute like he did. I don't think I could do that for sure. You know, but maybe it's more than just a prayer of the morning. Maybe it's more than just a prayer of the morning and the evening. Maybe it's throughout the day that as we see different things and we run into different people and different occasions of praying for them. During that message, we ended the message and we talked about a man named Honi. And Honi was a sage of the Jewish. He was a Jewish sage that was right there right before the first century. And if you remember, we talked about this guy. Jerusalem and that whole area was under a huge drought. And I mean, it was just devastating. You know, when you think the deal in California was bad, I mean, this was you know, people were dying. It was just an extremely difficult time for the people. And Honi, He walks in, and the legend tells us that he walks in with a 6-foot staff, and many of you that were here have heard this story. For those of you that hadn't, here's the refresher on it. That basically, he takes his 6-foot staff as he walks into Jerusalem, and people are kind of gathering because they know Honi. They know who he is and that he's a man of God. And he walks into the middle of Jerusalem, and he takes this 6-foot staff, and he makes himself a circle. And he makes this complete circle all the way around, and he kneels down into this circle with the staff still in his hand. And he begins to pray for rain. Well, as things go, you see a crowd, and then a crowd gathers more of a crowd, and the crowd gets bigger because the more of a crowd. And so here's this crowd of people as they're all around. And Honi simply says, I am not leaving this circle, God, until rain begins to fall upon this land. A little bit later, a few drops begin to fall, and a few drops here and there. And Honi prays, he says, God, this isn't the kind of rain I'm praying for. I'm talking about a rain that basically will be the kind that fills cisterns, the kind that basically waters the crops and allows things to grow, that it fills caverns, that it makes a difference. And at the end of that prayer, all of a sudden it began to rain. And the story tells us that the raindrops were the size of chicken eggs that began to come down. And it began to rain harder and harder and harder. And pretty soon, the waters began to rise because obviously there wasn't a big drainage system that they had, for them at that time. And so it began to rise, and people were rushing to the Temple Mount. And Honi prayed again. He says, this is not the kind of rain that I prayed for, God. The kind of rain that I'm praying for is the kind that waters the land and gives it life and gives it nourishment. And the rains begin to slow, and it began to take the drought away. And so this was one man who decided that he would try to make a difference and that he would simply pray. Now, what I didn't tell you is what happened to Honi. Would you like to know whatever happened to him? Well, part of the story is that Honi sits there, and after it's done, the religious leaders, they're kind of upset about this whole thing because they're the ones that's kind of in charge of the praying stuff and making things happen. And so they're upset with Honi because he's like been part of this miracle, and they wonder, what kind of powers did he use, to do this? Because that's what they did. They investigated these kind of things. Fortunately, the people, said, hey, he was praying to God. It was a God miracle, and, Honi, leave him alone. And so the religious leaders stepped back, and they said, all right, we'll leave it alone. But what happens is in 63 BC, basically there became a civil war there in Palestine. And the Jewish people begin to fight against themselves and to war against themselves. And as they begin to battle and to war, they came upon a stalemate. A large group of one faction was inside of Jerusalem itself in the religious city. The other side was on the outside of the city and had besieged it. In other words, we've got it surrounded. Nobody's coming out. Eventually you're going to get hungry. You're going to get thirsty enough. Eventually you're going to need to come out of the city. And so they had surrounded the city. Not any different than our civil war, that we had within our own country. Of brothers, fighting against each other. Well, one of the army leaders, a guy by the name of Hyrcanus, basically he sent for Honi because he knew that he was a man of prayer. And he felt like that if I can get Honi to pray for our army, that we will prevail, that God will be on our side instead of their side. Both of them worshiping the exact same God. And so he called for Honi. And they brought Honi in, and the commander told him, he says, I want you to pray that this siege would end, and that we would be able to conquer the city again and be able to be the conquering army. But Honi stayed true to his convictions. He decided that he would pray. Here was the prayer that he prayed. I think it's going to be up on the screen for you. He said, O God, the King of the whole world, since those that stand now with me are your people, and those that are besieged are also your priest, I beseech you that you will neither hearken to the prayers of those against these, nor bring to effect what these pray against those.